Next on Currents News, Pope Francis is preparing to welcome the bishops of Brooklyn to the Vatican.
We go to make a report to the Holy Father about the status of our diocese.
A suspect accused of sucker punching a parishioner outside a Queens church has been arrested. We'll tell you about the charges he's facing. A driving force behind the fall of the Berlin Wall was St. John Paul II. 3 decades later, the lessons learned after the Cold War. He couldn't go back. The flames were too strong. Still, heroes on the scene saved his 200-year-old Bible. The news starts right now. Good evening, I'm Tamara Lane. Brooklyn's Bishop Nicholas DiMarzio is about to lead a major journey. The bishops of the diocese are going to see the Pope. It's a big deal that only happens once every 5 years. Currents News' Emily Druby begins our coverage just as the bishops are taking off for the Vatican.
It's one of the most important moments for any bishop, meeting with the Pope. And this will happen again soon as Bishop Nicholas DiMarzio, the other bishops of Brooklyn, and those from across New York State report to the Holy Father.
This will be the highlight of the trip for all of us.
The big meeting is the chance for the New Yorkers to give the Holy Father a rundown on the latest developments in their churches.
The report, when you read it yourself, you recognize things have changed over time, where we could do better or where we've done better. So it's kind of a self-evaluation.
Usually bishops from around the world meet with the Pope every 5 years, but New York's bishops haven't been to Rome as a group since 2011. Already other American bishops from the Boston Archdiocese and other parts of New England are at the Vatican meeting with Francis today. Besides seeing the Holy Father, the U.S. bishops will also meet with other Vatican officials.
And we are actually going to present the documents of Monsignor Bernard Quinn that will be reviewed by the Vatican Commission for Saints. We are happy that we'll be able to actually bring them in person.
While in Rome, the bishops will celebrate 4 special masses.
We also will go to the 4 basilicas, St. Peter's, St. Mary Major, Lateran, and St. Paul outside the walls, where we celebrate Mass together. That's one of the obligations.
In addition to reporting to the Pope, the mission to Rome is also about learning and being inspired.
He may offer us some insights that come from other countries and from other local churches around the United States.
A way to grow, to self-evaluate, and to connect the local and universal church together. In Brooklyn, Emily Druby, Currents News.
Stay right here. National correspondent for the Tablet and Crux, Christopher White, is moments away with more on the bishops and the Pope, plus another big event set for next week. He's still ahead in this newscast. The man who sucker punched a woman outside a Queens church is behind bars. Cops charged 36-year-old Chung Wang with both assault and harassment yesterday afternoon. He was caught on camera punching a parishioner of St. Michael's Church. He had been kicked out of the Flushing parish for disrupting Mass only moments before. Turning to the impeachment battle on Capitol Hill, a top aide to Vice President Mike Pence testified today. Jennifer Williams is a longtime Foreign Service officer. House investigators questioning her knowledge of how much the vice president knew about the efforts by President Donald Trump to push Ukraine to investigate political rival Joe Biden and his son. Up until now, all the impeachment hearings have taken place behind closed doors. That will all change next week when investigations go on TV. Suzanne Malvo reports on the possible impact of televised testimonies.
House Democrats announcing televised public impeachment hearings will begin on Wednesday, starting with top diplomat to Ukraine Bill Taylor and Deputy Assistant Secretary George Kent. Then next Friday, Marie Yovanovitch, the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, who was fired by President Trump.
Those open hearings will be an opportunity for the American people to evaluate the witnesses for themselves.
It comes after House investigators released more than 300 pages of Taylor's testimony where he revealed it was his clear understanding security assistance money would not come until the president of Ukraine committed to pursue the investigation. Taylor also discussed his concerns with Trump's personal attorney Rudy Giuliani's involvement with Ukraine policy, calling it a nightmare. House Democrats hoping Taylor's public testimony will help shape their abuse of power case against President Trump.
If you want an initial hit, someone to describe exactly what took place, I don't know if anyone's better than Ambassador Taylor.
His earlier deposition was seen as damaging, alleging an explicit quid pro quo with Ukraine, with Trump freezing military aid in exchange for Ukraine announcing investigations against the president's rivals for political gain. Trump's Republican allies continue to change their defenses, including highlighting this part of Kurt Volker's testimony, telling lawmakers, "I didn't know that there was a quid pro quo."
His account is consistent with the fundamental facts. There was nothing wrong with the call transcript.
Other Republicans taking it a step further.
What I can tell you about the Trump policy toward the Ukraine, it was incoherent. They seemed to be incapable of forming a quid pro quo.
That was Suzanne Malvo reporting. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton was a no-show on Capitol Hill today. Bolton was on the Ukraine call that led to the impeachment investigation. President Trump is slamming a report that Attorney General Bill Barr refused to clear Trump of wrongdoing over the Ukraine call. Trump tweeted this morning, "Bill Barr did not decline my request to talk about Ukraine. The story was a fake Washington Post con job with an anonymous source that doesn't exist." Barr hasn't said anything about the story. The Justice Department prosecutors concluded the telephone conversation with Ukraine's president did not amount to a criminal violation. President Trump is being ordered to pay $2 million in damages to a group of nonprofits. The move is part of a settlement of a lawsuit that accuses the Trump Foundation of financial mismanagement. A New York State judge finding that the president breached his duty by using the foundation to further his political career. Mexican officials have a new focus tonight in their investigation into the brutal deaths of a Mormon family. Authorities have learned that hours before the gunfire rained down on 9 Americans, 2 criminal groups had a turf war nearby. The shootout resulted in at least 1 death and 1 injury. Police believe the clash is connected to the attack, but are still not sure the family was somehow involved, or if the incident was a case of mistaken identity. The Mexican government has beefed up security in the area since the attacks, but many are feeling much more could be done to stop the violence in the country. Matt Rivers is on the scene with the latest.
Well, it took us hundreds of miles of driving on small, winding mountain roads to get to this part of very rural northwest Mexico. And when we arrived, we found an area teeming with a military presence. At the checkpoints, soldiers covered their faces, guns and armor aside. Better to stay anonymous in such a violent place. Bienvenidos a Bavispe, the town closest to where 9 Americans were slaughtered on Monday. So this place is so locked down right now that we're being given a military escort to the area where at least one of the shootings happened. The massacre started here. This is the exact spot where Renita Miller and 4 of her kids, ages 12, 10, and 2 8-month-old twins, were killed. They were ambushed by armed gunmen, shot, and their vehicle lit on fire. This is what remains. Up the road a few minutes later, 2 more cars were ambushed. 2 mothers and 2 children also killed by gunfire. Another 7 kids escaped. They'd all left just minutes before from Renita's home, just a few blocks away. They were part of a community of hundreds of Americans, largely Mormon, who have lived here for a long time. Julian LeBaron found one of the bodies.
And then she was just laying on the ground when we came on her, and I could tell that, I could tell from the blood stains that they aimed for her heart.
The family wants to know who would shoot and kill women and children and then light their bodies on fire. They think the families were specifically targeted by drug cartels, though they don't know why. This community has had run-ins with gangs before, but say this came out of nowhere.
We haven't been threatened, at least not in any way to suppose that women and children would be murdered.
Mexican President López Obrador campaigned on the need to reduce crime in this country, though Mexico's murder rate now stands roughly 6 times higher than that of the United States. The president insists his strategy of poverty reduction will eventually ease drug violence, but some are losing patience.
That was Matt Rivers reporting. Authorities are saying American-made firearms were used against the victims. Bad news tonight from Washington about Christian persecution. It is spiking sharply around the world. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom is saying faith groups are under serious and sustained assault. And the crisis is getting worse in many places. The biggest offenders, according to the government, are Iraq, Syria, and Egypt. There is a glimmer of good news coming out of Iraq. The papal charity Aide to the Church in Need is hard at work restoring churches that were desecrated by ISIS. They're rebuilding 19 churches in the Nineveh plains that were ruined by the terrorists. The effort is being described as a major turning point for keeping the faith alive in the birthplace of Christianity. There's a lot more news headed your way. More on our top story. The Brooklyn bishops reporting to the Pope. Christopher White is up next. Catholics have strong opinions about unmarried couples living together. We'll hear from the firefighters who braved flames to save something very precious. Do you have a story idea or want to share a tip? Email us at newstips@desalesmedia.org or call our 24-hour number, 718-517-3122. We'll be right back. More on tonight's top story. Bishop DiMarzio and other bishops of the diocese will be delivering a highly anticipated report to Pope Francis next week. At the same time, a national summit is set for Baltimore, where other clerics will tackle big issues facing the U.S. Church. National correspondent for the Tablet and Crux, Christopher White, joins us now. Christopher, thanks so much for being with us.
A pleasure to be with you, Tamara.
For most Americans, protecting young and vulnerable people from sex abuse is a #1 issue. What can we expect from the bishops on this issue when they meet with the Pope?
Well, so when the bishops meet with the Pope, it's certainly going to come up. I mean, this is going to be, probably a 2-hour free-ranging conversation about what is on their mind. And of course, this issue back at home is front and center. But again, the purpose of this meeting is, a more personal encounter, a pastoral visit. So I think the Pope will sort of try to comfort them and guide them through this, but it's not going to be, they're not going to come away setting new policies. Instead, they're going to focus on, how can the church, together with the Pope, lead in the face of this crisis.
So besides meeting with the Holy Father and other Vatican officials, what else will they be doing on this meeting?
Well, so this is a time, they'll meet with a number of officials, and it's a lot of sitting around tables and long conversations. But part of this is that, they make pilgrimage to all the apostolic basilicas in Rome. So it's a spiritual time of unity. They celebrate Mass together every day. They have time together as meals. Many of them meet with their seminarians at the North American College. So for a lot of them, they say it's just a real bonding experience that they don't typically get in the States because it's rare that they're all together in one place.
So let's look at Baltimore. The rest of the U.S. bishops will be in Baltimore next week for the General Assembly. What can we expect from them when they're together?
Well, I think the top thing that everyone is paying attention to are elections. So the U.S. bishops will elect new leadership to replace the outgoing president of the conference, Cardinal Daniel DiNardo, and Vice President, currently Archbishop Jose Gomez. Many expect that Archbishop Gomez will succeed Cardinal DiNardo as president of the conference. Beyond that, the bishops will hear a report on the developing plans to enact new third-party systems for reporting bishop accountability measures in the U.S. They'll elect a number of officers for, other committees, religious liberty, ecumenical issues, and the protection of minors. So it's sort of an ongoing process, but this is an attempt to sort of get back to business as usual, acknowledging the crisis in the church related to abuse, but move on beyond the scandals.
All right, Christopher White, national correspondent for the Tablet and Crux. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Tamara.
Nearly 3/4 of American Catholics are saying they're opposed to a moral teaching of the church. They're telling Pew Research it's okay for unmarried couples to live together. According to a new survey, only 14% of adults did not believe it was ever acceptable for two unmarried people in a relationship to live together. By contrast, 69% said it was okay for unmarried people to live together. In the survey, it also found that 16% of respondents agree with cohabitation only if the couples plan to marry. Senator Elizabeth Warren is being dropped from a lawsuit that said she badmouthed a group of high school students. Covington Catholic High School claims that Senator Warren made defamatory comments following an encounter between students and a Native American on the Washington Mall last January. The judge dismissed the claim, saying the senator had immunity. Tonight, a good story growing out of the California wildfire disasters. The blazes burned most everything in their paths, but thanks to a bunch of heroes, something very precious and about 200 years old was saved. Wayne Friedman reports.
With every burned house in the Kincaid fire, a story of what is, what was, and how it came to ashes. These from a dream home in the vineyards of Highway 128, where Jeff Thompson spent 35 years of his life.
I felt stupid for not grabbing stuff, but I figured I'd be back, so.
Hey, let him know I'm going to try to flag down another rig.
It didn't work out that way. This video shows what firefighters faced as high winds pushed flames everywhere. And yet, out of this, Jeff Thompson's small miracle from the fire began.
By the time firefighters arrived, this house was well ablaze. There was no saving it. But they did look inside. They saw pictures on the wall, family items. They gave themselves 3 minutes to save what they could.
We just did it.
Captain John Nelson and his crew from the Ophir Hill Fire Department near Grass Valley told us by phone how and why they took the calculated risk in a burning home.
I kind of thought about it as if it was my house. I would want pictures that were still on the walls.
And keepsakes, including a 200-year-old Bible from the old country. Before departing the scene, the firefighters left what they saved in a pump house. Now Jeff has them in the back seat of his pickup truck.
You know, it was above and beyond.
Not just that they did this, but also that they took items as if guided by an unseen force.
This is the box that was up on a shelf.
The box contains recipes that belonged to his wife, Lori. She passed away 10 years ago.
You know, like my son said, it's just stuff, Dad, but this is important.
So said the man who thought that stuff, filled with memories, had gone forever, just like so much else.
Wayne Friedman filing that report from Sonoma County. That wildfire destroyed 400 homes and buildings. Still to come on Currents News. The Berlin Wall. Ronald Reagan demanded it be torn down, and St. John Paul helped make it happen. An expert joins us to talk about that and the lessons learned from one of the biggest moments in history. And please check out one of the latest features in the tablet, the Our Diocesan Family page. That's where you can send in photos of your family receiving certain sacraments, such as baptism, First Communion, confirmation, and marriage. For more information and to submit your pictures, go to thetablet.org/OurDiocesanFamily. We'll be right back.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
President Ronald Reagan's unforgettable words at the foot of the concrete barrier dividing Berlin. The world will soon celebrate one of the greatest moments in history, the fall of the Berlin Wall. The communist rulers in East Germany erected the barrier to keep people in, Germans who wanted to escape to freedom. This Saturday is the 30th anniversary of the barricades being removed. The bishops in Europe marked the anniversary in a statement, noting the impact of the wall's demise while saying, having been separated by a concrete wall for more than 28 years, people, relatives, friends, and neighbors living in the same city were able to meet each other, celebrate, and express their joy and hopes. From this moment, the world looked different. The fall of the Berlin Wall is not only a past event to be celebrated, but it's also a prophetic dimension. It has taught us that constructing walls between people is never the solution. Stephen Millies teaches at Chicago's Catholic Theological Union. He's written an article about the lessons of the Berlin Wall, and he joins us now from Vancouver, Canada. Professor, thank you so much for being here with us.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Let's begin with the role of St. John Paul II. He's credited with being a driving force in the downfall of the Soviet Union. How exactly did he accomplish that?
Well, I'm always cautious about giving credit to one person, of course. On the other hand, John Paul was an extraordinary person in an extraordinary circumstance. He'd had the experience of learning from the Nazi and then the communist domination of Poland about how to deal with an intractable enemy of Christianity. So I think we would want to pay attention to those elements in his biography, but we'd also want to pay attention to the historical forces that were always in play and that always worked against the Soviet Union and their project, both internally economically and externally in terms of their territorial ambitions around the world. Finally, though, we'd want to notice that just 2 years after the Berlin Wall fell, John Paul issued an encyclical Letter Centesimus Annus, where he, of course, pointed out the failures of the Soviet system, but turned his attention to the problems in Western political and economic life as well that were also dangerous to Christianity. He had a broad view that was focused on more than just Soviet communism.
So at the height of the Cold War, the world was divided into two, the United States in the West versus the Soviet Union in the East. After the wall fell 3 decades ago, there was hope for peace on the planet, but there isn't peace. What's gone wrong and what lessons should we have learned?
Well, the short answer is sin. We're human beings, and there's only so much peace and justice that I think we can hope for on our side of the eschaton before the second coming. But that all being said, I often think that we failed to heed the lessons that John Paul tried to teach us in that 1991 encyclical letter when he talked about the dangers of capitalism and the ways in which even Western social and political life fail to value the human person. Most of the time, I think we in the West looked at the end of the Cold War as a victory, as something we had won, and we've spent too much of the last 30 years, I think, feeling good about it, rather than asking ourselves hard questions about how we should be building a better world.
Interesting. You've made the point that a just world depends on restraining power with the moral force of law. What must be done to make that a reality?
I come back to something Pope Francis talked about in one of his morning homilies, and which appeared in his recent document, Gaudete et Exsultate. He talks about the little gestures of humility, and he begins with the 3 right words. He calls them please, thank you, and sorry. And it's not as though saying those 3 right words will bring about world peace or justice, but they do get to the heart of the matter, and I think really the problem with how the U.S. and the West handled the end of the Cold War. What Francis is calling us to is always to remember to lead with humility, not to celebrate a victory, not to try to win something, and certainly not to celebrate when we do defeat someone, because that's a sort of a failure. We always have to begin down the road of humility, and the best way to do that is by beginning in our own lives with the 3 right words, please, thank you, and sorry.
So quickly, I want to ask you, where were you when the Berlin Wall fell, and what memories do you have of that momentous event?
I was a senior in high school in Chicago, Illinois, and I certainly can remember very well watching it on television. I wrote in the article about how we had heard, I had been reading, it had been in the news, that the Soviet Union might not be able to survive all that much longer. It was hard to imagine that something like that could be true, and yet very suddenly that night it was. I think many of us sensed everything had changed that night, but I think one of the reasons you and I are having this conversation today is we still don't understand what that change means. That's something we're still trying to figure out.
Stephen Millies of Chicago's Catholic Theological Union, thanks so much for being with us today.
It's been great. Thank you.
Finally tonight, many Germans tried to scale over the Berlin Wall to reach freedom. Others tried to go underneath. Now one of the escape tunnels they use is being opened to the public as part of the anniversary. It's about 100 yards long. At today's ribbon cutting, the mayor of Berlin said it's great to see that the battle for freedom was also taken underground. That is Currents News. I'm Tamara Lane. Thank you for joining us because we are putting your faith in the news. Hope to see you again next time.